Attraction, Shifters Forever Worlds, written by Elle Thorne, narrated by Megan Kelly. Chapter 1. A crash of thunder preceded May as she stormed into her home. Before she slammed the door behind her, a flash of lightning lit up the sky, making a stunning backdrop for the olive-skinned, full-figured beauty. Of all the damn nerve! She stomped her foot, kicking at a chair's leg. Ouch! Damn it! Why was she acting like a teenager? Him. It was all his fault. How dare Jake? No, she corrected herself. She shouldn't be thinking of him as Jake. He was Doc to everyone else. And as many years as she'd known him, she'd have thought that by now she'd have become accustomed to that moniker. But he'd always be Jake to her. Jake. The man she'd fallen in love with. Correction. He was the shifter she'd fallen in love with. She'd thought after Brad had died that she'd never find love again. Her heart had been broken. She'd been content with the dream she had of rebuilding Bear Canyon Valley into the shifter community that it used to be. She'd only been good friends with Jake. Doc. Oh, hell with it. She couldn't call him Doc. Just couldn't. He'd always be Jake to her. Sexy, amazing, muscle-bound Jake, the bear shifter. When she'd run into Jake again, he was a widower too. He'd been married to Astra's mother, who was killed in a shifter battle, leaving behind a little girl that Jake had to raise on his own, his stepdaughter, Astra. He'd buried Astra's mother and taken Astra to Florida, where he'd done a wonderful job of raising her. Then he'd come back to Bear Canyon Valley. May smiled as she thought of Astra, who had gifts, just as May did. Not the same exact gifts, but supernatural gifts just the same. She should look into Astra's gifts to see if she needed help, though she felt she was the last person who had a right to do so, since she'd ignored and avoided her own gifts for so long. The rain outside subsided a bit as she thought of Astra. I have got to get control of my emotions, or I'm going to create a flood in this valley. May muttered to no one in particular, since she had no company. Well, no human or shifter company. She had her black cat Zarina, but that wasn't the same. It wasn't like Zarina could talk. How dare Jake decide he was going to Europe? How dare he leave her behind? No, she told herself. How stupid of me to fall in love with him. The rain began again. More torrential now, with thunder and lightning flashes punctuating her every dark thought. She should have known better. Of course Jake only thought of her as a friend. Well, then she was a shitty friend, because she'd slipped out of Grant's home without an explanation other than she didn't feel well. She'd braved the hammering rain and wind, tears blinding her, and she'd come home. To pout, to sulk, to cry. She threw her purse onto the sofa. It bounced, and her tablet flew out and crashed to the floor, right on the tail of another boom of thunder. That was followed by a knock on the door. Who in the world would be knocking on her door after 9 o'clock on a Friday night? Of course, remembering that it was a Friday night didn't help, because then she thought about her standing Friday nights with Jake. Guess those weren't dates so much as they were two friends going out. She mused bitterly as she headed toward the back door. Jake looked around the mostly empty table in Grant and Chelsea's dining room. The help was picking up the plates gingerly and quietly, being careful not to disturb anyone. They obviously sensed the tension in the room. Wow, guess I know how to break up a dinner party. He flashed a rueful grin at his stepdaughter. Doc, you didn't... Astra's words trailed off. Her beautiful luminescent green eyes studied him as if he were a child. Astra had always called him Doc, though on rare occasions she referred to him as Dad. Either name worked. He was the only father she knew, and she'd told him many times that he was the only father she wanted.
"What?"
He shrugged.
"All I said was that I was going to Europe too, and poof, there goes May. Poof, there goes Tanner and Teague. Poof, damn near everyone cleared out."
Chelsea and Grant were sitting across from him at the long table. Chelsea was smiling at Astra in that way that women had, the way that said they knew what the other one was thinking and they agreed completely. Jake turned toward Grant.
"You have a clue what I did wrong?"
Grant shrugged.
"I'm staying out of it." "Well, isn't that just great?"
Jake rose.
"Excuse me. I think I'm going to go out for a beer."
Grant laughed.
"Yeah, like that's going to do anything."
True, alcohol had no effect on shifters, but it would give Jake an excuse to get out of here and go somewhere to think. He knew exactly where he was headed to. Astra rubbed her temples. Kane looked at her, concern on his face.
"Are you okay?"
Doc leaned closer, listening to her pulse with his shifter hearing. It was weak, slow. "Yes, just a headache." Astra stopped rubbing and took a sip of water.
"She gets those far too often,"
Kane said.
"And they're increasing in frequency and strength."
Astra laughed weakly. "Dr. Kane, I presume?" she teased him.
"I'm serious."
Kane frowned, brows dipping on his stern face. "It's fine. Probably the weather. Barometric pressure, or sinuses, or something." Astra waved him away with a smile. Kane looked at Jake pointedly. Jake got it without further instructions. He needed to look into the situation. Sheesh. He should ask May, except she'd stormed off. It was something he'd done, that much he'd figured out, but he wasn't sure exactly what. Chapter 2. May opened the door and gasped at the drenched sight before her.
"Tanner, what are you doing here?"
Tanner, soaked after walking in the pouring rain between his truck and her front door, looked like a puppy that had been playing in puddles. A big, muscular puppy.
"Better question is, why are you opening the door without bothering to see who it is?"
He frowned, and his handsome face with its trim beard was stern.
"Don't be silly. Who would be out here that could be a danger to me?"
The moment those words left May's mouth, she realized how stupid they were. She could easily think of several threats and dangers. Chelsea's psycho ex, Derek. Jeff, the unstable stalker realtor, who was hung up on Chelsea. The rover shifters who had attacked Kane. She looked down to keep Tanner from seeing the chagrined look on her face.
"But what are you doing here?"
she persisted, holding the door wider and handing him a kitchen towel to dry his face with. Teague stepped in behind Tanner, equally soaked, equally handsome, but with a clean-shaven face.
"Teague, too. Did you call in the National Guard as well?"
She made a show of looking behind them.
"Why would we do that?"
Teague asked.
"Didn't you just say there's no one out here who could be a danger to you?"
She avoided answering that question on the same grounds that she hadn't answered the last one.
"Where are Marty and Kelsey?" "Kane and Astra are giving them a ride home. We wanted to check on you." "Two big old bear shifters coming to check on me?"
She gave them the eye.
"I don't think so. What gives?"
They looked at each other. Tanner went first.
"May, you know we owe you. You helped us out when we needed you most."
May cocked her head.
"And you wanted to make sure I was okay because..."
She waved her hands, urging them to move forward with their explanation.
You got pissed when Doc said he was leaving. You left in a huff. A somewhat subtle one, but still a huff. And then a storm happened.
So you're thinking I have something to do with the weather?
Come on, May. It's us,
Teague said.
We know what you can do. We lived here. We saw the rain during times that other areas had drought.
Coincidence, May harumphed.
Coincidence, too, that every time you visited Brad's gravesite, it would rain in the cemetery, and only the cemetery?
Damn them, they were way too perceptive.
You've known all along,
she mused.
Yes, ma'am,
Tanner said.
And we haven't told a soul that you're an element caster.
Why didn't you mention it a decade ago, or more?
May?
Tanner put his arm around her.
You're like our older sister.
Teague winked at her.
Though when he was a teenager, Tanner did have a crush on you.
Tanner jerked his arm away and turned a deep red.
I was a kid. Damn.
May slapped Teague's arm playfully. Don't embarrass your brother.
On a serious note,
Tanner added,
we would never divulge your secrets, but we do know that Doc's announcement bothered you.
That's my issue to deal with, she reassured the hunky bear shifters. There's more you're not telling me. You know I'll find out.
Fine.
Teague caved first.
Kane found a scent.
She frowned. A scent of what?
Kane thinks it's a polar bear.
Tanner's face was grave. Marty, Tanner's mate, had a son who was a polar bear. May knew that Marty didn't want it getting out that she had a polar bear shifter child. She shook her head. This wasn't good. First of all, it meant there was a trespassing shifter in their territory. Secondly, it made her wonder if there was a connection to Marty's son Dominic. She reached for the teapot, wanting to keep her hands busy. She filled it with water and put it on the burner. Let me see. I'll call... Good grief, she'd almost said Jake. She couldn't call him anyway because things had changed. They weren't as close as she'd always thought they were. He'd planned a trip to Europe without even mentioning it to her until it was a done deal. Let me do some thinking, she told them.
Why don't we call Doc?
Tanner asked. Clearly, like her, he knew that was the normal way things were done. They would call her or Jake, and then she and Jake would get together and talk and come up with solutions. No, don't go calling Doc. She set the table with 3 cups for tea. The man has a trip to plan and suitcases to pack. He's embarking on more than a trip. He's embarking on a new life. One that doesn't involve me. Chapter 3. Jake parked his car in his driveway and jumped out. His home wasn't quite the mansion that Grant's family had, but he hadn't done poorly. He had built a successful practice in Florida, then made some investments and was well set up for life. His home was a brick-and-wood 2-story that he'd bought when he first arrived. The driveway was empty since he lived alone, now that Astra was living with Kane. It was dark outside. The moon was barely a sliver. That had no bearing on his mission. He shifted into his bare seconds after slamming the door shut. He needed to go out into the woods. He needed to roam, to think. He might even need to settle a matter with his bear, if his bear would let him broach the subject. 40 minutes, multiple trails, and a long run later, Jake pulled to a lumbering stop. His bear was winded, but happy to have had the exercise. Jake shifted back to his human skin and sat on a stump. He broke a twig off a nearby bush, stuck it in the corner of his mouth, and chewed.
Now can we discuss it?
His bear grunted.
I have every right to be confused. Everything I've ever known about being a shifter has been turned upside down. Everything I've been taught flies in the face of what I'm feeling now.
His bear was quiet.
I wish you'd argue with me.
Jake knew the bear wouldn't. He knew the bear wanted him to sort this out on his own.
How can May be my mate? We've both had other mates.
Jake shook his head. He didn't know why he was struggling with this so much. His bear insisted this was the way it was and not to fight it. But Jake had to fight it. He'd had his mate, Astra's mother, Anna. Jake wondered what she'd say about the way he felt about May. He knew. She'd say, "Be happy. You can't be unhappy for the rest of your life." He cast the twig into the bushes. None of this mattered. May didn't want him. Brad had been May's true mate. She considered Jake a friend.
All the more reason for me to get the hell out of Bear Canyon Valley.
Maybe he could forget May in Europe. Her olive skin and dark hair, full lips, full hips, and a sassy attitude. He exhaled a sigh. It was pointless to be in love with her. Pointless trying to get over his guilt about being in love with her. It violated their friendship and tore him in half.
Lot of good this outing did me.
Jake castigated his bear.
You were supposed to help me reach a resolution.
His bear roared in his head, drowning out all sounds in the forest, even drowning out his thoughts. Jake's blood pressure was rising. He could feel it. What the hell was his bear thinking?
Seriously?
He didn't bother mind communicating with his bear, but he was so agitated he spoke the word out loud.
You'd think I'm being silly, that I should roll with it. What happens the moment I tell her how I feel about her? It will upset the dynamics of the valley. She's put a lot into rebuilding this valley. A few words from me could destroy our working relationship.
His bear went quiet.
Fine. Now you want to give me the silent treatment.
Wait a second. His bear smelled something. With a quick creaking sound, bones and tendons, skin and flesh stretching, Jake shifted into his bear. Whatever it was, the bear felt they'd handle it better in his form. Jake had learned not to argue. Jake inhaled, his nostrils flared. His bear grunted and pawed at the forest's pine needle-covered floor. A scent wafted his way.
Bear.
Not one of the Bear Canyon Valley shifters. This was an unfamiliar scent, that much he could tell. The scent was faint, and it wasn't easy to discern any details from it. Maybe if he followed it through the forest, he'd be better able to tell some details. He raised his head, picked up a trace, followed it a few paces. Raising his head again, he sniffed. He snarled. Polar bear. Jake approached a tree and leaned into it. Definitely polar bear. Not just a regular polar bear, of course. A shifter. A male. And it had rubbed right here. On purpose? Marking territory? Surely he knew this wasn't their territory. Jake had never had any real contact with polar bears. The only one he knew was Dominic. Could this bear have something to do with Dominic? It seemed to be out of bounds to discuss Dominic's father with Marty. She veered the conversation away from that topic any time it was broached. Jake followed the scent up a trail that led away from town. He never picked up the scent of another bear, just that one, and when he reached the creek, it stopped. He scoured a mile up and down the creek's opposite bank, but couldn't find another trace. That meant the bear had gone through the creek. Who knew how many miles?
So he wants us to know he's here, but he doesn't want us to find him.
He'd ask May. No, he couldn't. He shouldn't. He should find a way to do things without May. Yeah, right. As if they hadn't been attached at the hip for a long time now. She'd be better off without him around all the time. She'd find someone to make her happy. The last thing she needed was to be with a shifter again. His bear snarled at him.
I can come up with more reasons for staying away if I need to.
His bear's snarl turned into a thunderous roar. He would not be denied his mate. His bear had decided that May was the one for them. Okay, Jake couldn't argue that. He was already in love with May, had been for a long time, but he had to do what was right for her, what was right for the valley's shifters. Back to the polar bear. Plan of action. What would he do?
Fuck if I know.
He'd come back in the morning. There was bound to be some sort of an answer to this by then.
Just a matter of looking,
he told his bear.
We'll find the answer in the forest.
Chapter 4. May woke up too early to go out. She'd have lain in bed a hell of a lot longer if her mind hadn't traveled to Jake's bed during her dreams.
Jake.
The thought of him, his sexy abs, the long-sleeve shirts he wore, couldn't hide that body. The bulge she'd glimpsed in his pants was evidence the man had quite a package. Her sleep tank was loose but threadbare and saturated in sweat. Still half asleep, she shouldn't be so aroused. Her body shouldn't be drenched in perspiration, and there definitely shouldn't be a pool of liquid heat between her legs. She was aroused and in need of relief in a big way. She squirmed in the bed, but that didn't help. It rubbed her legs together, putting pressure on that one spot that didn't need encouragement. Her clit twitched, aching for Jake's touch. A touch she'd never felt, but one she couldn't stop thinking about. Her body trembled, shaking, quivering. It had absolutely nothing to do with the temperature and everything to do with the pure need she had for him. She slipped her hand into her sleep shorts, her mind absorbed with Jake. Thinking about the sexy, muscular, panty-wetting face, that was Jake. Her second index finger touched her clit. Though it was still hooded, she flinched. The intensity of that touch made a moan slip from her lips. May closed her eyes, spreading her folds with eager fingers. God, but she was so wet for him. Another moan of sheer desire came out unbidden, making her wish he was there. She could imagine the color of his eyes, the shape of those lips. The thought of those lips and his tongue on her was too much. She bypassed her clit and plunged her fingers deep into her wet channel. A quick gasp and a few thrusts were all it took for her to throw herself wholeheartedly into a fitful orgasm. She didn't even have a chance to take out her vibrator. The thought of his mouth on her pussy, of him driving his tongue into her, was more than she could handle. Her body ached, her clit tingled. She let a long, low moan out as she began another orgasm, her other hand finding her clit, pressing, tweaking, circling. May had orgasm after orgasm, with nothing more than the thought of Jake and her fingers. Completely spent and overwhelmed by emotions, she jumped out of bed.
I'm ridiculous. This is ridiculous.
How could he have such an effect on her? Jake was determined to figure out the polar bear's location. He was hoping that he'd be able to follow its scent all the way past Bear Canyon Valley's boundaries. If the scent didn't extend past their boundaries, that meant the bear was roaming their territory. It also meant he'd have to do something about it. He woke up in the pre-dawn hours with a start. He was drenched in sweat, and his cock was hard as a rock and in his hand. His mind was on May, her full figure, the way her ass curved upward into those amazing hips, down to her waist, then flared wider again as it reached her breasts. She had the perfect hourglass figure. Damn, did he really have to think of that while he was awake? His cock twitched in his hand, its pulse throbbing, pre-cum sliding out. He rubbed his thumb over it. Fuck, he'd rub one out thinking of May right now if he didn't have to go polar bear hunting. Jake's bear roared in agreement. Was May safe? Surely she was. Maybe he'd swing by her home and make sure there wasn't any sign of a disturbance. Then he'd head out and find the trespasser. Part of Jake burned with fury at the idea of an unfriendly shifter being in their territory. It couldn't possibly be friendly. Why wouldn't it have announced itself to the other shifters in the valley instead of skulking around, creeping through the forest and staying out of sight? And worst of all, far worse than all the rest, it had dared to leave its mark on their territory. Jake wasn't so hardcore that he'd deal death as a penalty for that without listening to the other shifter's side of the story, but he knew this sign of aggression was probably not accidental. He threw the sheet off and jumped in the shower. After getting dressed, he slid into his truck and made a quick detour to May's. Odd, the light was on. He passed her driveway, made a U-turn, killed the lights, and coasted to a stop in front of her home. He watched from his truck, feeling like a creeper. If the light was on, that should be a good thing, right? It meant she was home and fine, right? No, wrong on both counts. Unless he saw May, he wasn't going to be convinced that anything was fine. Appearances be damned. He was going to check on her. Just as he'd stepped one leg out of the truck and onto the asphalt, he saw her silhouette walk by the window. Holy hell, she was naked. No, she wasn't, but she might as well have been. Her nightie was sheer, she wasn't wearing a bra, and the top of her nightie seemed to be damp. What the hell was she doing in that thing? Running a marathon? He couldn't tear his gaze away from her curves, the way her hips swayed, the way her body filled out the fabric that clung to it like a second skin. The shadows her form made on the wall were better than any shadow puppet could ever dream of being. Then he got pissed. Any a-hole could be out here looking at her. Christ, what the hell was she thinking, walking around dressed like that with her blinds open? She was begging to become a victim. His bear roared in agreement.
We should have a talk with her, soon.
He swallowed the lump that had risen in his throat. The idea of May living alone several miles away from town and anyone else bothered him. Anyone could watch her. Anyone could do anything. He shook his head to clear it. He needed to get back on the road and hunt down the trespasser. The sooner he found the source of the scent, the sooner he could make the area safe again. Chapter 5. May knew better than to do what she'd planned, but that didn't matter. She knew that if Tanner and Teague found out what she was doing, they'd be angry with her. That didn't stop her either. She'd managed to get them to leave last night, though they'd insisted that she should stay with one of them. As if she'd leave her home. She wasn't going to let fear drive her away. What she was doing now was foolhardy, but this was her valley. Fear wasn't going to keep her prisoner or force her to go everywhere with an escort. The day was overcast, perfectly matching her mood. How odd that Teague and Tanner had known for so long that she was an element caster. Odder still, they'd never shared that with her. She tied the shoelaces on her hiking boots.
Polar bear in our territory? My ass.
May would get to the bottom of it.
And I'll do it without Jake.
In the distance, thunder rolled faintly. After she'd grabbed 3 bottled waters, some trail mix, and a sandwich, May locked the front door and slipped the key into the planter on the stairs. She slipped around back and headed toward the forest. An hour later, May paused, brush crunching underfoot. She was in a clearing scattered with wildflowers. The trees around her teemed with wildlife, chattering birds, skittering squirrels and rabbits, and buzzing insects. It was as good a time as any to take a break. She sat on a fallen tree, a victim to high winds months ago, judging from the bark's weathering, and took out the trail mix. She wasn't ready to stop looking, though she didn't know what she thought she'd find or how she'd find it. She didn't have the senses that her shifter friends had. Sure, Brad's bond had given her some boosts, but nothing like Jake's or Grant's or any of the other shifters.
You do have other skills,
her elemental spirit reminded her. That came as a surprise. Her elemental spirit rarely dropped in for a visit. She hadn't practiced those skills for years. She barely remembered the few things she'd been taught back then.
And by the way, nice of you to decide to be active again.
May didn't lighten the sarcasm.
You're the one who wanted nothing to do with me or your gifts, or those of your kind. I came because I thought you might need me.
Her elemental's voice was devoid of emotion.
For what?
She asked, stopping mid-bite.
You seem to have a heightened emotional state. I haven't seen you this way since Brad died.
May's elemental spirit wasn't like the bears that lived inside the shifters. She and Brad had talked about the difference once. She'd tried to explain to him that it wasn't as if she shared a space the way that Brad did, with his bear always there. It wasn't like that at all for May and her elemental. The elemental appeared only on occasion and randomly.
She's more like a fairy godmother,
May had told Brad. Brad had laughed and told her that if she had a fairy godmother, then she must be Cinderella.
Funny,
May had responded. That had been the day before he died. A sprinkle of rain peppered her face.
Great, just great. I don't need rain doing this to me.
Then stop thinking those thoughts. There's something we need to discuss, her elemental said in her mind.
Not this again, for Pete's sake. I'm not talking about Jake, not with you, not now,
May huffed.
Not Jake, Astra.
May paused.
Astra? What about her?
She has an elemental.
What? Are you sure? I've never... Well, maybe I have seen indications.
You need to help her. Work with her.
She's leaving for Europe. It will have to keep.
Unless you go with her.
Oh, hell no. This is just an attempt to get me to go after Jake.
You realize you don't have to talk to me out loud.
I feel crazy when I talk to you in my mind.
As opposed to sounding crazy when you talk to me out loud. May shook her head and rolled her eyes. Talking in her head creeped her out. You need to get past that sooner or later. Did you ever stop to think I'd come around more often if you'd talk to me? But your rejection of me, coupled with your compulsion to only talk to me out loud, makes it difficult. The last thing I want is for others to hear you talking to me and then for you to have to figure out how to get out of that. A century ago, you'd have been hung as a witch for that kind of action.
I don't need a lecture, thank you very much. I'm not going to Europe. Astra and Kane are going to find Anya. I'm not going to tag along on that trip for this. We can deal with her elemental when she gets back.
What's the problem with Jake?
Don't act like you're not around and don't know what's going on.
Another thought came to May.
And don't try to convince me that I should.
Stop. Her elemental interrupted her. Someone's coming. Or something. May put the trail mix back in the bag. She rose to her feet, head cocked, listening.
I don't hear anything,
she told her elemental. There you go. That wasn't so bad, was it?
You did that on purpose to get me to talk to you in my head.
A loud roar punctuated May's sentence. She dropped her bag and whirled around. Chapter 6. Half hidden by a large tree was the most enormous polar bear May had ever seen. It stood on its hind legs, paws against the tree bark, claws bared, each of them longer than her hand. Those claws could take her apart with one swipe. They could completely decapitate her. Not messing around with that one, her elemental snorted. I'll kill him before he comes too close. If you die and I'm inside you, I die. That will not be allowed to happen. That wasn't something May wanted to see happen. Not her death. Not her elemental's death. Not the shifter's death. Not until she found out about this bear shifter and why it was here. She didn't believe it was here accidentally. She rarely believed in accidents. She had to dilute the potential for conflict before the elemental became too concerned.
Hey,
May said to the bear. The gigantic white-furred creature cocked its head, its ears twitching as its black eyes studied her. Its gaze wasn't giving away any emotion. She couldn't tell if it felt malice or curiosity or a mix of both.
Why don't you shift into your human form so we can talk?
May asked. Its head cocked to the right, its claws stretched, their razor-sharp tips catching on the tree bark. The bear flicked its paws, releasing its claws from the bark, then dropped them back down with a click. Tap, tap, tap. The bear clicked its claws on the tree.
Maybe he's reminding me that he's armed. Maybe he wants me to be afraid.
May took a deep breath. She was afraid. She was trying to control her pulse so that the shifter wouldn't read her trepidation. Her elemental skills hadn't been tested in a long time. Not like this. Not in a battle. Would she be able to protect May from the shifter? May wasn't sure, so she preferred to rely on her own skills to negotiate her way out of this.
Please? I'm no threat to you. Just shift. All we have to do is talk.
The shifter slipped behind the massive tree where she couldn't see it.
Great. Now what?
May took a step backward. She'd rather try to outrun the bear than have to find out that her elemental couldn't protect her. May heard a sound she knew too well, creaking and stretching that meant a shift was happening. She waited, curbing her instinct to take more backward steps and then run. A man walked from out behind the tree. He was tall, much taller than Jake, even taller than Tanner. He was a huge man and wide. His muscles bulged beneath his shirt and his thighs stretched out the fabric of his jeans. He resembled a modern-day Viking. Dark blue eyes, long wavy blonde hair with a touch of red highlights hung over his shoulders and onto his chest. The sleeves of his collared shirt were ripped off at his shoulders. They emphasized biceps and triceps that were larger than some tree trunks. She held her breath at his massive size. He was studying her in silence. No smile, nothing on his face that could be called an emotion. It was a handsome face, but it seemed to be marked with a touch of cruelty. It came from the set of his lips, not quite full, but not a thin line either, and they were set in an unfriendly curve. He had a scar from cheekbone to lip. The scar wasn't new. It had gone white, but it was large enough to be visible behind stubble that bespoke of days without a razor. May's throat housed a lump the size of a softball. She tried to swallow around it so she could talk.
"Who are you?"
He cocked a brow.
"They."
He crossed his arms over his chest, the fabric of his shirt stretching, protesting.
"You."
"I'm May."
"You live here?"
He had an accent, a faint one, but May couldn't place it.
"I live near here, yes."
It seemed only fair that he should answer the same questions she did.
"Where do you live?"
He cocked his head again, just as he had when he was in bear form.
"I do not live in any one place, not for long."
That wasn't much of an answer. Was he a rover? Was he a mercenary shifter who roved and did deeds, misdeeds actually, for money? She was weighing what to ask him next and wondering what approach wouldn't piss him off when he took a step forward.
"Are there any that look like me in the area?"
he asked.
"Why are you here?"
she inquired. They both asked their questions at the same time.
"You're here to find others that look like you?"
A shiver ran through her as she thought of little Dominic, Marty's shifter son. She decided to play a little dumb and ask another question.
"When you say, 'look like me,' do you mean bears?"
He frowned and exhaled an exasperated breath.
"Polar bears."
He took another step closer. "If he comes much closer," the elemental warned. May tucked her hair behind her ears, stalling while she thought. She could turn around and run. That was the best plan right now. But she'd have to do it before he came too close. If he got his hands on her, she was screwed. She answered him.
"This isn't a polar bear community. It's a grizzly community."
Not exactly a lie, not really. One baby polar bear shifter couldn't be called a community. He rubbed his jaw, the sound of his stubble scratching loud in a forest that had gone completely silent. Why had the birds gone quiet, May wondered. Why was everything so tranquil? It was almost like the calm before a storm.
"I heard there was a polar bear in this area."
2 more steps forward.
"A young one."
Another step.
"Please don't get any closer. You're making me nervous." "What do you have to be nervous of, pretty lady?"
He pushed his hair back. His lips were curled into a sneer. He really was an attractive man, but there was an undercurrent of danger in him, and it wasn't the kind of danger that would make her feel attracted to him. It made her nervous. His head tilted left, his eyes lost focus for a second, then he turned the dark gaze back on May.
"My bear seems to think that you know something."
He let out a small groan, a sound that seemed to come from deep within him. His face elongated, his skin stretching. May wanted to look away. The sight of a shifter going into their animal form wasn't something she enjoyed watching. It looked painful to her. She couldn't look away. That would be the same as letting her guard down. She should run, but her feet felt as if they'd grown roots into the ground. His nose grew into a snout. His face now was a muzzle. Fur had sprouted and was growing before her eyes. White fur, thick and plush. His shoulders became rounded, his body thick and ursine. He dropped to all fours, fully shifted into his polar bear. A growl began in the bear's chest, then he bared his teeth and snarled. May gasped. The bear lifted his head and roared. May took a step back, then another. She tripped on a limb, failed to hold on to her footing, and landed with a hard thud. The polar bear ambled forward. His mouth was still open, bearing long teeth dripping with saliva. A jolt rushed through May. The sheer power of it made her grab at any object she could for stability. She latched onto a long limb that extended behind her, seeking purchase, seeking strength. The fierce energy flow pulled on her, sapping her of her will and power. A bright blue light blinded May. She closed her eyes against it, knowing it was her elemental, though she wasn't sure if the light was in her mind or if it was in front of her. The sound of a crash, followed by an odd pelting, forced her eyes open. A spear of ice was protruding from the bear's shoulder. It was at least 2 feet long and thicker than her finger. Ice darts the size of pencils were hailing down onto the bear. The bear roared, swatting at the ice, his eyes glowing with fury. He screamed with pain as another spear of ice, at least as long as the first one, pierced the flesh of his shoulder, close to the first one. In May's mind, her elemental was screaming, howling like a banshee, casting curses on the bear. The bear roared one more time, shook its mighty head, then turned toward the forest and ran at a quick pace, loping away from May. May breathed a sigh of relief just as everything went black around her. Chapter 7. When Jake heard the first roar, he shifted into his bear and took off toward the sound. There was no reason for a bear to roar like that unless it was trying to frighten something or attacking. The forest went silent, and no matter how he tried, he couldn't glean a sound, even with a sensitive bear hearing. So he'd walked, slowly making his way through the trees, looking for signs of the polar bear. Nothing. He found himself wishing for another roar so he could better find the source, but at the same time, he was worried for whoever or whatever was on the receiving end of that roar. He scented for the bear, taking his time with every tree, practically every boulder, every cave. Where in the hell was that bear? Then it occurred to him, what if the bear had decided to use block?
Damn it.
His only choice was to keep wandering until he found or heard something. He didn't have a chance to wander much longer. He heard the roar again. Still in his bear, Jake rushed through the forest, trying to be as quiet as he could, but not making quiet a priority. Speed was more important. He had to get to wherever and whatever the bear was threatening. Jake pulled up short. On the other side of a clearing, he spotted May. She was still, talking to someone in the shadows. He focused to see who it was, as the person was hidden behind a tree. The person stepped out, a giant of a man, muscle-bound, dressed in a cut-off shirt and jeans, long hair falling halfway down his back. His demeanor wasn't threatening, but it wasn't friendly either. Anger pierced through Jake like a bolt of lightning. He considered May to be his fated mate, and she was focused on this other bear. This was unacceptable. Who was this male? Then it hit him. What if she was interested in this other shifter? What if she was receptive to him? Jake's bear growled deep in his chest. The growl rumbled upward into his head. If she wanted this man, there was nothing Jake could do. He had no rights.
Walk away. I need to walk away and leave her alone.
He felt like an interloper. Then again, as his bear's snarls reminded him, he had no clue whether or not May was actually interested in this other shifter. Plus, he had heard the bear's roar. He knew something in this forest wasn't friendly. If it was this big blonde shifter now talking to May, then he should find out. He shouldn't just walk away from that.
Is it that, or is it my jealousy speaking?
Suddenly, the vibes from across the clearing changed. The energy there was now charged with danger. The bear shifted. May stepped backward, and then the bear was on 2 legs and advancing on her. Jake began to run across the clearing as fast as his legs would take him, keeping his eyes on May and the polar bear shifter. A snarl grew in Jake's chest. May was moving backwards. He was about to yell at her not to do that when she tripped over a branch and fell backward. She paled, and it looked like the breath had been knocked out of her. The bear reared up, its claws fully extended as it swiped at the air. That fucking bear was threatening May. He was going to kill it. He was halfway across the clearing when the ice began to fall.
Damn.
It confused Jake for a moment, bringing him to a sudden halt. Directly over the polar bear, ice was shooting down at a remarkable speed, a barrage of ice bolts hurtling down from the thick boughs of the trees. An ice bolt pierced the polar bear's shoulder, and he howled in pain, his roar making the leaves shake. The polar bear took another step toward May. A torrent of bolts fell on and around the bear, and he snarled his anger as another bolt pierced his shoulder. The bear froze, pawed at the shoulder, looked back toward Jake, then thrashed his head and rushed toward the forest, away from the ice, away from Jake. Jake took 3 running steps forward. He had to get that bear, but he also had to make sure May was all right. She slumped forward, lolling like a rag doll, then fell backward, her head dropping into a bed of leaves. Thank God for that. She wasn't getting up. She wasn't moving. Jake stopped. Bear be damned, she was more important. Jake took off at a run again, this time toward May, shifting mid-stride without pausing, without stopping to assess. When he reached her, he pulled her forward and checked her scalp. She was fine, but very pale and still unconscious.
How?
He wondered. Her fall to the leaves hadn't hurt her enough to make her lose consciousness. Of that he was certain. He listened to her heartbeat. Definitely weak. Damn it, what had caused her to pass out? The ice. She'd caused it. Somehow. What was there about May that he didn't know? He needed to get her to safety immediately, and then he needed to go hunt that damn bear down. It was as good as dead as far as Jake was concerned. After that stunt with May, it was as good as dead. He picked her up gingerly and began a fast-paced walk back to his truck. He didn't want to run for fear of jarring her and hurting her further. She didn't regain consciousness. When he was within sight of his truck, Jake dug his keys out of his pocket and used the remote to unlock it. He managed to yank the door open without losing his grip on May, then laid her on the bench seat and got in after her. He pulled his cell out of the glove compartment.
Think,
he told himself.
Think.
The people who lived closest were Astra and Kane. He'd take her there. He'd have Kane help him with the polar bear. He made the drive in record time, maneuvering through the sharp curves as he traveled upward through the mountains. Kane liked being remote, and Astra loved Kane and had no problem with it. But Jake had always been saddened that their cabin was so far from his home. It seemed he had gone from having his little girl in his home, and then suddenly she had met the man of her dreams, and she was gone. For so many years it had been him and Astra, and then she was gone. Now, though, he was glad they lived out here. If they didn't, he wouldn't have somewhere safe to take May to so quickly. He dialed Astra's cell. She picked up on the first ring. "Hey, Doc."
I'm almost at your place. May's not conscious. Kane there?
He knew he was spitting the words out, but he couldn't take the time to think slowly. Adrenaline was still pumping through his body. "Yes, he's here. I'll get the guest bedroom ready." He pulled up, and just as he did, Kane came outside and opened the door of the truck. Always one for few words, Kane said nothing as he stepped back to let Jake pick May up. "What happened?" Astra blurted as she rushed out of the cabin.
There's a polar bear. He attacked May. No blood?
Kane said, closing the truck's door behind Jake.
He never got the chance to reach her,
Jake answered. They moved inside quickly, Kane again holding the door open for Jake. Then why is she unconscious? Astra asked, pulling the sheets back so Jake could lay May on the bed.
I don't know. It's going to sound crazy.
Kane frowned. Tell us. Astra touched May's forehead with the back of her hand. She's not hot to the touch. I'll get a washcloth and some water.
There was a bear. He was going to attack her. Suddenly, all this ice started to pummel him. Just him. Just this little area where he was. And this is going to sound even odder, but I swear it was coming from May.
Jake shook his head. Yeah, he sounded crazy.
Or it came from somewhere near May. Somehow. Yep, certifiable.
Astra wasn't talking. He looked at her. She was unmoving except for the washcloth. She was wringing and dipping it in the water, then wringing it and dipping it again. Over and over. Her eyes were transfixed, set on May. She had a strange look on her face.
Astra?
Jake touched her shoulder.
Astra.
Kane stepped around to her other side, his posture straight, the bear in him ready to protect her. She still appeared transfixed.
She doesn't hear me,
Jake told him. Astra was his daughter, but she was Kane's mate. Surely the bond they shared would help her hear him.
Astra?
Kane's deep voice was soft as he leaned closer to her. She turned toward Kane. Her green eyes, always so preternatural, glowed more than usual, a lemon yellow imbuing the fluorescent green. Shh! She shushed Kane and Jake. Don't you hear them? Jake looked at Kane to see if he was as weirded out by this as Jake was. Kane shrugged.
Who, baby?
His voice was a soft whisper. It's May. She shook her head. No, it's something in May. Someone in May. Astra tilted her head, her eyes rolling eerily to the side. No, it's someone in May talking to someone in me. Her eyes widened. Lime green in a sea of white with a black dot for a pupil. Dad? What's going on here? Her voice had a little girl sound with a sense of urgency. It reminded Jake of when she was a little girl, when her mother had been killed. The same panic, the same confusion. Jake looked at May. She was moving her lips silently. Suddenly her eyes flew open.
Astra,
May said with a reverent whisper. She sat up, took Astra's hands in hers.
She was right. Who was right?
Kane said. Chapter 8. May shook her head. She couldn't say. She didn't want to say. She hadn't even processed all of this yet herself. She took in the room around her, Astra's guest room.
Why?
The words were getting stuck in her throat. She swallowed hard and tried to clear it.
Why am I here?
She rubbed the back of her head where it throbbed a dull beat and tried to remember how she'd gotten here. She had no clue. The last thing she remembered. She looked at the faces in the room.
Jake? Why is Jake here?
Her elemental was silent. She'd gone away, but why? May tried to call her back, tried to remember the elemental's name. She'd told May once, long ago, but May had spent so much time apart from her, quashing the elemental, that she'd purposefully forgotten her name. Now she felt bad about that. May grabbed her head. She was so confused. Slowly, it came back to her. The polar bear, the ice that fell from the sky, her elemental. Astra talking to her elemental. No, that wasn't Astra. It was something in Astra. And now her elemental was gone, abandoning her to this confusion. Compound it with another issue at hand. Jake. How could she even think, knowing that he was here? Knowing that she'd accepted her feelings for him? Jake stood back behind Astra, but his eyes were on May. In the back of his dark eyes, she saw the golden glow of his bear. They both studied her through Jake's eyes. It felt like her soul was being infiltrated by both of them.
"Don't do this to me, please,"
she begged silently, knowing that neither Jake nor his bear could hear her plea.
"Please don't make me love you more than I do. Please, don't do that."
May? Astra stood in front of Kane. Her face was pale, her eyes wide, and her lower lip was trembling. May sat up and held her arms out.
"Come."
Astra drifted into her arms as if she were floating.
"I know this is confusing. I remember when I found out. It was very confusing. I remember the headaches and the mayhem it created inside me." "May?"
Kane put his hand on Astra's arm.
"What are you talking about? What's going on with her?"
"Remember how you struggled with your bear? Just know that Astra has something she's struggling with as well."
"Astra's no shifter."
Kane's jaw was set. "May, who was that I heard?" Astra asked. May looked at Kane.
"No, she's not a shifter like you and Doc."
She held Astra, running her hands over Astra's head. She placed her lips on Astra's forehead.
"But she's got something in her that she struggles with, something powerful."
Astra raised her head. "What now?"
"You'll have to live with it, to learn to manage it or avoid it. It's different for all of us who are imbued with an elemental. Some of us adjust well, and some, like me,"
she bit the words back,
"not so well." "You have this too?"
Jake asked. His voice coursed through May's veins with the same power as a drug. It heightened her senses. It made her body react, her pulse race, and her core tighten with need for him. May nodded.
"The ice,"
he persisted. Another nod.
"But I didn't. I don't use those. I mean—"
May didn't know what she wanted to say. How could she tell him that she rejected her elemental more often than not? That she wasn't at peace with the gifts the elemental brought her, mostly because she didn't know how to harness them.
"And whose fault is that?"
Oh, now the elemental was back.
"Yes, it was my fault,"
May conceded. She had to mind talk to the elemental now, or face making everyone think she'd lost it completely. She could already see doubt on Kane's and Jake's faces, though Jake had seen the ice incident. He knew something was going on with her, clearly. May turned her attention back to the elemental.
"I left the order and didn't fully develop my skills. I had my reasons."
"And now you'll suffer the consequences of those decisions you made," the elemental huffed at her. Beneath. That was it. Her name. Beneath. "That's right. Thank you." In her mind's eye, May could see her elemental nodding, an ethereal figure that looked more pale blue and smoky than she did human in form. They were all watching her. Jake and Kane had concern written across their faces, but Astra was looking at her with understanding. "You could hear us?" May asked her. Astra nodded. "This is so odd. If this thing has been in me all along, why hasn't she shown up until now? And why does she sound like she has two different voices? I hear her arguing with herself with different voices." May studied Astra. She'd never had that happen. Beneath only used one voice, and she argued with May, not with herself. She'd heard of... No. May pushed the thought aside. "It's true." Beneath said. What you are thinking is true.
Duality?
May asked.
She has two in her?
She does. One is more dominant, and they fight as to who can be out more than the other one. They don't let each other out at the same time.
I'm not equipped to handle that,
May said. She realized that she'd said it aloud when Kane and Jake whipped their heads in her direction.
Not equipped to handle what?
Kane frowned. May shook her head. You don't have to handle it. You can take her to the ones you rejected, the ones who tried to teach you, and you can let her learn there. Why don't you let her make the decision whether she wants the things you rejected? Those you ran away from can teach her. Then she can decide. May knew Beneath was right. She should give Astra the choice. It's fine. Astra smiled bravely, stepping back from May's embrace and into Kane's arms. He put an arm around her and held her close, her back against him. Smiling, she planted a kiss on his jaw. Chapter 9. Jake didn't want to bother May and Astra with this, not when they had so much going on with this elemental stuff, but it was time to decide on a plan of action for taking care of the polar bear. He turned to Kane.
Can you give me a moment?
Kane glanced at Astra, then nodded.
No.
May's tone was emphatic.
You're not going to cut me out of this. May.
Jake looked at her, though it was almost painful physically to do so. He swallowed down his aching need to make her his and breathed out a sigh.
You were hurt. You just regained consciousness. You don't need to be worried about this.
Her dark eyes glittered with anger.
I wasn't hurt. I was overexerted. I just needed rest. Now I'm rested.
Jake couldn't pull his gaze away from her eyes. There was something deep within them, an indigo tint in their dark depths. Was that her elemental? He tried to wrap his head around it. The May he'd always known.
Does this mean she's a witch?
The one thing that didn't change was the way he felt about her. Whatever she was fated to be his mate. They'd both been through hell, and they'd come out on the other side. They deserved some happiness. Doc, Astra broke into his thoughts. He looked at his stepdaughter. I really want to be in on this, too. Secrets hurt us more than they help us. She looked at him pointedly. Speaking of secrets, Jake turned an accusing glance toward May. She'd been harboring her elemental as a secret for as long as he'd known her. May turned away, a guilty look on her face. Jake nodded.
Fine, we'll talk here.
Kane slipped into the other room and returned with 2 fold-out chairs. He sat Astra in the wing chair by the bed and pulled out the legs on the folding chairs for Jake and himself. Jake rubbed his hand over his face, then looked at May.
I saw you and that polar bear talking.
A tiny flame of jealousy flared in him again, though he knew nothing was going on between them.
Would you like to start there?
May plucked at the bedsheet, then began tracing its patterns aimlessly.
He's looking for a polar bear. I told him there was no polar bear community here.
Did that answer satisfy him? Astra asked. May shook her head.
He asked if there was a polar bear here, a young one. Sounds like he's looking for Dominic.
Kane surmised.
Sure does.
Jake put his hand over May's because she'd begun to pluck at the fabric. She raised her eyes to his.
We need to talk.
He wished he could say the words to her.
What do you suggest we do?
He asked her instead of saying the things he wanted to say.
We should try to talk to him.
There was something pointed, almost strange in her expression.
A lot of things can be resolved by talking.
Was she sending him a hidden message? Did she want to talk to him? Would she talk to him about this attraction between the two of them? Or would she deny it out of obligation to Brad? Why don't you two go? Astra suggested.
Not a chance in hell.
Kane's tone brooked no argument.
That would leave the two of you here unprotected. He's right.
Jake reached for the phone in his front pocket.
I have a thought. Teague and Tanner can go talk to him.
What about Marty, Dominic, and Kelsey? You don't want them left alone, do you?
Nope.
Jake agreed with her.
We'll have the guys take them over to Grant and Chelsea's while they look for the polar bear. Grant's place is tighter than a fortress. It's shifter-proof.
Kane nodded.
Sounds like a plan. I don't like sitting here doing nothing.
Don't even think about it. I'm not leaving, Astra declared. You're not taking me to Grant's place. I want to talk to May. Jake looked at Astra.
Get in line.
May's head snapped in his direction, but he ignored her for a moment.
I'm going to have a talk with this lady myself, but first things first. You two are going to Grant's. He and Joe can take care of you. Kane and I are going to be with Teague and Tanner. I can take them to the last place I saw the bear. Tracking shouldn't be a problem from there.
Jake spent a few minutes on the phone with Marty before they headed out to hunt the polar bear.
We're all going to meet at Grant's,
he said after he hung up.
After everyone is brought up to speed, we'll put the plan into action.
Chapter 10. Jake arranged to take May in his truck while Astra and Kane took Kane's. As soon as he'd pulled out of their driveway, he delved into the questions he had for May.
What about that shifter? There's more to this than you're telling me.
He cast a sideways glance at her, admiring her profile, the way her nose had the slightest upward tilt, her full lips, and defined cheekbones. He purposely kept himself from exploring her body, though he wanted to check out the rest of her, to enjoy her curves in a profile view. She looked at him, her gaze intense.
We need to talk to Marty. She might be able to shed some light on this situation. Do you know him? Have you ever met him before?
Jake asked her, containing a twinge of jealousy.
He said his name was Kozlov. I may know someone who knows him. Like who? Mikhail Romanov. I've heard of him. New York, right? Yes. He's got connections. He can help. Let's see what Marty has to say first,
Jake advised. Grant opened the door with a smile that was underwritten with a look of concern.
You're the first ones here. I haven't told Chelsea much.
A muscle ticked in his jaw.
The baby, you know. What's going on? Why the meeting? Why are we hunkering down?
With Chelsea expecting, Grant had become very protective. Jake got that completely.
There's nothing to worry about. She can join us in the meeting. It won't stress her out. So what's up then?
Grant persisted. Jake and Grant had been friends too long. He wasn't going to make him wait.
Polar bear. In the forest. Attacked May.
Grant's face turned grave. He looked toward May and Chelsea sitting on the sofa.
She okay? Yeah. So, couple things.
He briefed Grant on the polar bear and May's and Astra's elementals.
Can't say I'm surprised about May. Too many coincidences, you know?
Grant studied May. They'd been friends a long time.
But Astra? That one's surprising, though I always knew there was something about her. I just wouldn't have figured that.
Marty and Tanner walked in, followed by a very boisterous Dominic, who couldn't wait for Ivan to come. Dominic didn't have long to wait. Joe, Sarah, and Ivan strode in the front door. Everything was interrupted by the excited squeals of Dominic and Ivan, happy to have a play date, with no clue about the concerns that surrounded the adults in the room. Right behind them were Teague and Kelsey, Kane and Astra. Astra smiled apologetically. We should have gotten here quicker. Sorry, my fault. They all convened in the dining room while the little ones were set up in a corner with an assortment of toys to keep them busy while the adults talked.
Couple of things. I'll start with this first, because it's not the one that requires a plan. At least, not a plan we need to make. It's something that Astra and May will be discussing in further detail.
May and Astra both nodded. Jake told them about the elementals, to the oohs and ahs of Kelsey, Chelsea, and Marty as they reached hands out to Astra. Sarah sat back a notch. She hadn't yet become close to the other women and was always a little distant. Jo had said she'd get past it, but for now, it was what it was.
So that's that,
Jake said.
Now for the other bit.
He brought them up to speed on the polar bear's appearance and interaction with May. He asked about polar bears specifically? Marty had lost all color in her face. Tanner put his arm around her, his gaze on Dominic, his jaw set. Tanner had come to view Dominic as his own, which was no secret. The two were inseparable. May nodded.
Yes. Do you?
Jake didn't know how to say it without upsetting Marty.
Could you tell us about Dominic's father? I don't want to stir up any painful memories.
I was in the wrong place at the wrong time, Marty began. Tanner's palm slapped the table.
No, I won't have you saying that.
A muscle in his temple ticked. He bit his lip, flesh turning white as he gained composure.
He raped her. Bottom line, no consent was given.
Marty nodded, her eyes flooding with tears.
He said his name was Kozlov.
May said. Tears began to flow down her cheeks, but Marty didn't say a word. May handed her a tissue.
That's the man?
I don't know his last name. Marty dabbed at her face.
Huge. Tattoos? Long blonde hair.
Marty nodded.
Seems cut and dried.
Tanner's voice had an undercurrent of steel. May's face was full of compassion, and her voice was low when she spoke.
What if that's Dominic's father? We don't want to kill Dominic's father. We don't want that on our conscience.
Jake wasn't buying that bullshit.
That bastard raped a woman. He's not the kind of man who needs to be in Dominic's life. He's not the kind of shifter we want here. But we'll go as you wish. I'll spare him if he steers clear of the valley and its residents. So be it,
Grant said.
Let's go.
Jake pushed his chair out.
Tanner and I will go together,
Teague announced, his expression as foreboding as Tanner's.
Doc and I will follow in my truck,
Jo said.
I'll stay.
Grant looked at a worried Chelsea.
Kane, mind staying with me?
Kane nodded, though Jake could tell he wanted to join them, but was torn about leaving Astra behind. It made sense, though, to have 4 bears going and 3 staying. Grant nodded his thanks.
Between Kane, Sarah, and me, we should be able to handle anything here.
Marty's mouth opened. Grant put a hand on her arm.
We'll keep it outside. Don't worry. No one can come in. Trust me. This place is impenetrable. It's been tried.
Chapter 11. Jake hated leaving May behind. It was one of the toughest things he'd ever had to do. He wanted to talk to her, needed to talk to her. Every second that passed, he felt like he was putting something away that mattered way too much. Jo cleared his throat. His long hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and his tomahawks lay on the bench seat between them.
What is it, Doc?
He asked, looking away from the road long enough to glance at Jake.
What's what?
Jake frowned.
Something's eating at you. If I had to guess, I'd say it's a woman. Oh, yeah? Why would you say that?
Jo tapped on the steering wheel, paused for a moment, and then answered.
Probably because you had the same look I imagine I had until not long ago.
Jake looked out the window. He didn't want to answer.
Why don't you just talk to May? Sometimes that's all it takes. Talking. That's not a newsflash.
Jake bit back his smart-ass comment.
Seems like ever since the moment I decided to talk to her, all kinds of shit keeps happening. The polar bear, the elemental thing. Sometimes I wonder if maybe I'm wrong about it. I was going to leave town. Running away doesn't help anything. Ask Sarah, she'll tell you.
Joe tapped on the brakes and nosed the truck onto a gravel road.
Maybe what's happened is you waited too long. Could be. Hopefully not too late. You clearly haven't seen the way she looks at you, Doc.
Joe shifted into park, then looked at Jake.
I'd say not.
Jake looked around.
Where are Tanner and Teague? They turned off a couple miles back.
Joe shoved his keys in his pocket.
I thought they were following us. Maybe they know something we don't,
Joe said.
Or maybe they scented something.
Jake pulled out his phone. Missed call. Teague. Odd. He'd never felt the vibration. He pressed to return the call and got no answer. He left a message for Teague that they were going into the forest.
Do we forge on?
Joe asked.
Let's push on. They can scent which way we've gone if they come this way. Either way, we're going to the same area, so we'll run into one another.
Jake and Joe trekked through the forest. They maintained silence while Jake used his bear senses to try to find the polar bear. He and Joe would handle it without Tanner and Teague.
Did you hear that?
He turned to Joe.
Sounds like growls. No, but something's going on. The forest seems off.
They took off at a run. Roars and growls filled the forest, bouncing off the trees, echoing against the boulders. Jake entered the clearing to find a bloodbath. Completely unscathed, Teague was standing a few yards away, keeping his distance while Tanner and the polar bear were engaged in a battle. The polar bear's white fur was streaked with crimson, and Tanner's brown fur was darkened by blood. Jake couldn't tell which of them was more badly hurt or even who was winning. He approached Teague without shifting. If he shifted into his bear and established a sync with Teague, they'd be able to talk, but then they'd be excluding Joe.
Can you shift out so that we can talk?
Teague shifted. Before Jake could ask Teague a question, the roars coming from Tanner and the other bear escalated. The polar bear swung his mighty paw, digging into Tanner's flank. Enraged, canines bared, Tanner roared, shoving the white bear with his shoulder. Tanner dug his bite into the other bear's neck as he shredded his muzzle with his claws.
What's going on?
Jake raised his voice over the bear roars.
He knows,
Teague said.
Knows what?
Tanner's teeth were still buried in the polar bear's neck. The bear growled and roared his pain.
He knows about Dominic. When we asked him why he was here, he said he was going to kill Marty and the unwanted one she'd given birth to. How does he know? No clue, but then he started to talk about the night he raped Marty.
Teague shook his head.
Bastard got...
He cleared his throat.
He got personal. He got ugly. It set Tanner off. It would do the same to me,
Joe said.
He'd already be dead. If I run into the ones that Sarah knew...
Joe cut himself short with a shake of his head.
So I'd rather we let Tanner take care of his business. It's not an unfair fight.
Teague added. True, it wasn't. In fact, as large as Tanner was, the polar bear was a bit larger. The polar bear jerked to the right and freed himself of Tanner's grasp. He tackled Tanner, and they rolled into the shrubbery, leaving a broad trail of blood. Jake found himself holding his breath and released it.
So what does he want with Dominic? Did he say?
Jake was baffled by the polar bear's behavior. Both bears rolled to their feet. They were silent, staring each other down.
If I didn't know better, I'd have sworn he was trying to push Tanner's buttons on purpose. Why would he do that? That's damn near suicidal.
Teague paused, watching the bears, then he resumed.
They're synced. I have no clue what they're saying. I'm going to shift.
Teague was clearly worried about protecting his brother. But before Teague could shift, Tanner roared, a sound that was ripped from his soul that rendered the air static with his pain. He rushed the other bear, seized him by the neck, and severed his spine with a resounding snap. Clamping his jaws down on the polar bear's neck, Tanner shook his head and didn't stop, not even when he'd separated the head from the body. He kept shaking, sending arterial blood spewing all over the clearing, bathing Tanner in crimson.
Fuck!
Joe ran toward the bloodbath.
Tanner, stop!
Teague was yelling as he ran toward his brother. Tanner froze. His jaws opened slowly, and the other bear's headless body dropped to the ground with a loud thud. Tanner shifted into his human form. His face and clothing were drenched in blood, and his flesh was torn and shredded. His face was a mask of pain, which broke Jake's heart.
He shouldn't have,
Tanner panted.
He shouldn't have said that. When I grabbed him by the throat, he said 2 words. Ended. That's all. Why did he say that about her?
Teague wrapped his arms around Tanner.
You did what had to be done. Let it go.
Jake gave Tanner a cursory glance.
You need to shift and heal, at least partially, and we can't have Marty seeing you like that.
Joe suggested.
Let's get him to Kane and Astra's. He can borrow some of Kane's clothing. I'll shift and get him there,
Teague said.
He'll make it if he shifts. A short rest, a quick shower, and a change of clothing, and he should be as good as new.
Tanner didn't say a word. He looked shell-shocked. Chapter 12. Driving Tanner's truck, Jake pulled into Grant's driveway. Joe pulled in behind him with Tanner and Teague. They got out of the vehicles, and the front door of the house flew open as if someone had been on the lookout and seen their return. Jake couldn't say who ran out first. It was more like a mob scene. All the women, the shifters, and the 2 little ones ran out to greet them. Marty was the one who noticed first. One look at Tanner, and she stopped, stood completely still, studying his face. You... She didn't say anything else, just held her arms out. Tanner took her in his embrace, and it was hard for Jake to tell which one of them needed more solace, the giant bear shifter for what he'd done, or the woman who loved him and knew that what Tanner and his bear did, they did for her. I was so worried for you, she whispered in his ear. Jake could hear it because of his shifter hearing. He felt like an eavesdropper and shifted his gaze away. May's eyes were on Jake, those dark eyes that now glinted with a hint of indigo that he recognized was her elemental. The bond he and May had always shared was different now. The friendship was different. The easygoing, laid-back, relaxed bond carried an electric undercurrent. He couldn't look at her without that undercurrent surging through him as if an electric shock machine was hooked up to him. Maybe it was a good thing he had that plane ticket. He didn't think he'd ever be able to go back to the friendship they used to have. He could go forward with whatever he felt, but he couldn't go backward. There wasn't a chance in hell of that. His fear was that May wouldn't want to go forward. She had Brad's memory to honor, Brad's love to pay allegiance to. He breathed out what felt like an anchor-ridden sigh. Jake felt eyes on him and turned to catch Astra watching him with a strange glow in her eyes. He still hadn't gotten used to the whole elemental thing, but if anyone was strong enough to handle it, Astra was.
Hey,
he said to her. She practically ran from Kane's embrace to wrap her arms around him. Doc, I was so worried.
You should have known you didn't need to be.
I don't just mean the polar bear. She cocked her head. Her eyes now glowed a deep yellowish green. I mean May, and you. You and May. She pulled away from him, but kept her hands on his shoulders. I'm uninviting you to Europe, Dad.
What?
I take it back. I'm going to find Anya on my own. Well, not really. I'm going with Kane. I think you need to stay here. You have unfinished business.
Is that a fact?
He quirked a brow at her. Are you saying there's no attraction? No attraction at all? Jake felt the heat of his denial in the form of a flush that filled his face. This girl had always been able to call him on everything. He shook his head while his heart burst with pride. She was every bit as incredible as her mother.
You know, you're amazing, just like Anna.
I know, Dad. And I know that wherever Mom is, she wants you to be happy. And that woman over there? Astra indicated May with her head. She makes you happy. Then Astra stood on tiptoes and leaned close to his ear. And you are totally fucking it up, Dad. Just saying.
Young woman,
he put a stern look on his face.
I thought I taught you better than that, and to speak that way to your elder.
Doc, you haven't looked like my elder since I hit 22. A few paces behind Astra, Kane's lips were twitching as if he were fighting a smile.
She's a handful, Doc.
Jake shook his head.
Sure is. Glad she got the right man to keep her in line.
He laughed and ducked as she swiped at him. They were the last three outside. Everyone else had gone inside.
Let's join them,
he said. They were all assembled over dinner at Grant's place. The subject of the polar bear hadn't been brought up yet. It was the elephant in the room. It had to be brought up, though, sooner or later. It seemed Marty was ready to do so first. So he's gone? Marty leaned against Tanner. That's that?
That's it.
Jake nodded.
I'll get a cleanup crew on the site.
May pursed her lips.
I'm nervous about who to call. I don't want this getting out. Some of the polar bear families have connections I don't want to see us getting involved in. We better keep this one in-house,
Grant agreed.
I don't want to risk anyone asking questions about a polar bear. Anyone want to join me tomorrow?
All the men volunteered, including Tanner.
Maybe not you,
Grant said.
You need a rest. I support you in what you did.
He put a hand on Tanner's shoulder.
Completely. I can handle it. You've handled enough,
Jake affirmed.
Let us do this. We're in it together. We're family,
May agreed.
Come on, May.
Teague held out her coat.
Kelsey and I will drop you off.
Jake reached for May's jacket and took it out of Teague's hands.
I'll take May home.
But, May started to say. Jake gave her a look and held her jacket out.
I'd like to discuss some things with you.
She stilled and licked her lower lip nervously.
Okay,
she said, then slipped into her jacket. Chapter 13.
This isn't the way to my house.
In the truck's dimly lit cab, May glanced his way.
No, it's the way to mine. I thought you were giving me a ride home. May.
He pulled over to the side of the road and found a dirt road, which wasn't a surprise to him, since it was his property. He thought maybe she'd feel better talking in a neutral place.
We need to clear the air.
Of what?
Can we take a walk?
He'd feel better if he could get out into nature, if his bear could feel comfortable and help him out with this. He felt so damn tongue-tied.
Sure.
She reached for the door handle. He slipped out and beat her to it, opening the door. He closed it behind her after helping her out. May stepped gingerly onto the road strewn with rocks that were sharp beneath thin-soled shoes.
Easier to walk over here. The forest's much kinder than these stones.
He took her hand and led her toward the path. The second his fingers wrapped around hers, a current ran through him. He sucked a sharp breath in. It was like a surge of voltage that originated where their skin made contact and made its way through his body faster than his blood seemed to travel.
You didn't feel that?
He jerked his hand away, surprised, caught completely off guard. He wasn't even sure what he had just felt, but he felt it straight to his core.
"That?"
she asked. Jake stopped. This wasn't going to work if he was the only one who felt these things. If she didn't feel them, it meant his bear was hellishly wrong for thinking that she was their fated mate. And it meant that he was a fool for having fallen in love with her. Granted, he couldn't control loving her, but his bear should know better.
"Never mind."
His voice was a low grumble. It seemed Astra was mistaken as well. Hell, they were all mistaken. May merely thought of him as a good friend. What he felt was one-sided. Though by damn, he'd have sworn it wasn't.
"Jake."
He loved that she called him Jake. She was the only one who called him that. It was almost like a special message or code between them, except that now, when she said it, for some reason, dread filled him. She continued.
"We've been friends for a long time." Here comes the gentle letdown.
His bear roared at him.
"Maybe I will take it lying down. What would you have me do? Force her to love me? Force her to... everything?"
A knot in his stomach jerked his intestines as if they were hooked on a treble hook.
"Don't say it."
He turned toward her abruptly.
"Just don't."
May felt like she couldn't breathe. Jake had said he wanted to take a walk. She knew that meant he wanted to talk. He was going to Europe. He was going to tell her it was a done deal. He'd asked her if she felt it. She did feel something. Was it what he was feeling?
Why am I struggling to communicate with him?
Because you're not being completely honest, Beneath said.
I don't need your input.
I think for once you do, Beneath argued.
I doubt you'll pay me any more mind than you ever have. You'll probably shut me away like you did for many years.
If May could have rolled her eyes at Beneath, she would have. She would have rolled them even though she knew Beneath was right.
Jake, I should say it. If you're going to leave, if you're going to Europe, I should be honest.
She drew in the night's cool air, filling her lungs.
At least this once. Go on.
He led the way toward a large rock and took a seat, patting the area next to him.
Something strange has happened to me. Your elemental? That stuff?
May shook her head.
No, other than that, though I guess at some point we should discuss it. Why did I say that? He's leaving.
He wasn't the same Jake she'd always talked to and turned to when she needed someone. He wasn't her inseparable friend any longer. He was now simply Jake, who was leaving. She had a feeling he didn't plan to return.
Why don't you just ask him instead of having a feeling that he may or may not do something?
Beneath butted in.
Why don't you just go away?
May plunged in.
Something happened to me, and I'm not sure when. I haven't wanted to think about it, much less talk about it. Is it something I can help you with?
This was the Jake she'd fallen in love with, damn it. His hand rested on hers, and that jolt that traveled through her when he touched her ran its course again, setting her veins on fire.
My couple bonding mark.
She paused.
The one that Brad gave me so long ago. What about it? For years after he died, it gave me comfort. It was a warm spot that reminded me that I was loved. It tingled when I thought of him. It warmed my being.
Tears came to her eyes.
It doesn't anymore. It's like it was never there. It's like I never had it.
Jake watched a solitary tear make its way down over the curve of her cheek. He could see this was hard on May, and part of his heart broke for her. He had gone through the exact same turmoil when he'd realized that the bond he'd had with Anna was gone. He'd woken up one day, and that invisible thread, that unseen connection that had kept them bound, even after her death, was completely gone. He remembered that day clearly because he'd gone into the forest with his bear and grieved. He'd run for hours and had gallons of tears over that lost love. His bear had comforted him and had tried to explain to him that this was a normal process, but Jake wasn't having it. Now he knew it meant that he'd fallen for May, that she was his fated one.
Wait a minute.
Jake jerked up, spine straightening.
Did this mean? Could it be? Hey.
He kept his voice soft, though part of him soared with excitement at the possibility. She turned dark, tear-filled eyes toward him. She blinked, and another tear slipped loose and trickled down her smooth olive-toned skin. Jake placed a thumb on it and pushed it upward, retracing the path the two tears had taken.
I know exactly what you mean. I hope you know that. I went through the same thing with Anna.
I feel like I'm dishonoring Brad's memory by not having that sensation on my neck anymore. She reached up and touched the spot where she'd been marked long ago.
Nothing. I feel nothing.
Her voice caught as if she was holding a sob back.
I felt the same way when I felt the bond with Anna break. It was devastating. I also came to an awakening. I realized that I was being given a second chance at life. I knew immediately what that second chance was, who that person was, and what it meant.
You did? Her voice was tinged with hope.
Yep. And I went out and got a tattoo. I knew I couldn't be wrong, but if I was...
He shrugged.
I wasn't prepared to be wrong. I'm still not.
What tattoo? Where?
Right here.
He put his hand on the spot on his neck where Shifter's couple bonded.
What is it? Want to see?
May laughed.
It's dark. It's not like I have your vision, Jake Evans.
God, he loved her laugh. He loved the way his name rolled off her tongue, as if it was a caress that roamed his body. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his cell phone, turned the light on, handed it to her, and moved his shirt collar aside. May drew closer, too close.
Christ.
He inhaled her scent. She filled his senses. May shone the light on his neck and gasped. She almost fell off the rock. Jake had to steady her with a grip on her elbow and a hand on her knee.
Easy now.
He didn't want her falling and suffering a concussion. A smile crept to his face as he had a thought.
Or worse, amnesia.
That's my name. Her words were let out in gasps. He let that knowledge sink in for a moment while she raised the light and studied it again.
And there's a date right there.
Her fingers traced the delicate script on his neck, her name, and the date he'd had tattooed next to it. The date Jake had figured out his feelings for her. Delicate and beautiful, exotic and fine, the font was exactly what she was.
It's now or never.
He cleared his throat.
May, the reason your mark changed, the reason it went away, I know the reason.
Her voice was low, husky.
I simply didn't want to accept it. Why not?
He wondered if her issues were the same as his.
I didn't want to diminish what I had with Brad. I didn't want to act as if he'd stopped being important to me, precious to me.
Her reasons were very similar to his.
And now?
She raised her head. Her lips were full, a dark cherry red in the darkness. The sliver of moon cast the perfect amount of light. He could not resist the attraction he had for her. It was so much more than an attraction, though. He lowered his head. Chapter 14. Jake's eyes flashed a golden glow she knew only too well. His bear was at the surface. Her mind knew what he wanted. Her mind wanted to say no. Sort of. Maybe? Her body and her heart had nothing to do with her mind. She held her breath and tried to swallow down the lump of anticipation. This was going to be it. This was it. This was going to happen. She let her breath out and sucked another lungful of air in. She couldn't tear her eyes from his. They held her captive. When Jake licked his lower lip, she fought the moan fighting to come out. Her body, the usurper that it was, had begun to full-on betray her. Her nipples pressed against the fabric of her lacy bra, erect, needy, pebbled, and wanting attention. Jake planted a finger beneath her chin, though he didn't need to. She couldn't have moved her head if she'd wanted to. That's how entranced she was with the moment she felt like she'd been waiting forever for. Jake caught her mouth with his, taking her lips prisoner while her legs began to quake with desire. He pressed against her, keeping her from toppling over. His taste was that of cinnamon and manliness. His kiss left her heady and intoxicated. His tongue wrapped around hers, took control, seized her heart and mouth with a fierceness she'd never figured she'd see in him. He wrapped his arm around her, pulling her tight against him, calming the quiver of desire, yet making it more intense. He pulled his mouth away from hers, leaving her breathless. Jake. His name left her lips in a panted whisper. Before she could determine if he'd made this happen or if she had, he was on his feet, facing her, and her legs wrapped around his waist. May looked down, her eyes caught on his chest. So broad. The muscles so defined. She raised her gaze, and her mind went back to that tattoo. Her name. God. He tattooed her name where a couple bond mark would be. She breathed a sigh, her chest expanding, her breasts pressed against his chest. The sensation was heady. Jake slipped his hands under the fabric of her top, working them upwards. He cupped her breasts, his fingers tweaking her nipple, rolling it between his thumb and fingers. May leaned back on her hands, arching her torso, her chest thrust forward. A heat surged in her center and traveled throughout her body. It was as if she wasn't in control of her own body. Passion was in control. She used her legs to pull him closer. His erection, thick and hard, pressed against her mound. She rolled her hips, pressing her clit against his shaft, their clothing still between them. His thickness applied just the right amount of pressure, sending her into a wave of pre-orgasmic state. He tugged on her top, lifting it over her head, and flicked the hook of her bra loose with a quick snap. Pushing the bra off, he stared at her breasts, lust altering his features, even in the dim night's light. The bear glowed fiercely behind his dark gaze. Reaching out, he cupped her breasts, weighing their fullness, both hands rolling her nipples, tugging on them, pinching them between his fingertips while he watched her face. When he lowered his head, May gasped, even though his lips hadn't even touched her yet. Still keeping his eyes on hers, he put his tongue on her nipple, flicked it, then sucked it in. May squirmed, her legs pulling his cock closer to her clit, closer to her entrance, even though all this fabric was between them. He sucked hard, his mouth pulling on her, drawing her in deep. His teeth scraped her pebbled hardness, making her skin goosebump in response. Jake pulled his mouth off her nipple with a pop, pressed her breasts together and her nipples as close to each other as he could. Then he ran his tongue between them, driving her crazy. Her moan made him pause.
"What do you want?"
he asked and drew her nipple in his mouth. I Oh, God, Jake. Pop. He made a smacking sound as he released her nipple.
Tell me. I want you.
She let the words slide off her tongue, except it felt more like they stumbled over her lips. He pulled away, tugging her skirt up over her knees, over her thighs. The chill air caressed her thighs, but couldn't cool the heat inside her panties. He ran his fingertip along the elastic of her panties, along her tummy. She felt self-conscious for a brief second, then he lowered his fingers and traced the elastic from her hip toward her inner thigh.
You're beautiful.
He cocked his head, studying her.
Sheer perfection, just like I knew you'd be.
May's face grew hot, and she was thankful for the darkness for a brief second before she realized he could see as well as he could in broad daylight. Her blush grew deeper, a hot heat on her flesh. Jake chuckled softly.
Where's that bold May who has an entire valley of shifters rebuilding into its prior glory?
May lost her nerve.
Finish.
His voice had the ring of authority. He was her alpha. He leaned his lips close to her ear, his breath a caress.
Please.
He said it, but it was more of a commanding plea than a request. May looked him in the eye.
She's right here, naked, full of desire, for you.
She ran her fingernails up the material of his shirt, letting him feel her nails and what she wanted to do to him. His muscles rippled under her hand, his abs tightened.
I told myself I wouldn't rush it. If I had a first time with you, I'd take my time. I'd make love to you slowly. I'd please every inch of you with my hands and my mouth.
He exhaled a tortured breath. He continued.
That was before I had you in front of me, the scent of you filling my nostrils with an aroma that's so strong I can almost taste it.
He traced the valley between her breasts with a feathered touch, then moved from one nipple to another.
May, it's taking every bit of my self-control not to let myself and my bear have you in the fiercest, most demanding, most taking way possible.
May felt like her heart had filled with the joy of 1,000 lifetimes. She didn't care about anything but being joined with this man right now. There was time for the rest later. This moment in time, she wanted nothing more than to have him deep inside her, branding her as his, making them one, giving her what she wanted to give him. Jake and his bear were torn. They cherished and adored this woman to such a degree that they didn't want to impose their will on her, but she made it too difficult. She was so delectable, creamy curves, rosy-tipped full breasts. When she reached for his pants, her fingers deft and nimble as they unzipped him, his breath caught. Her lips, her eyes with their occasional indigo flash, those cheekbones catching the shadows of the night. She was magic. She was his. He would take no other, and he would let no other take her. May pulled on his pants. With the speed of the supernatural being that he was, he shed his pants and took his position between her legs once more. The heat of her body, the moisture the apex of her thighs created, greeted him. Taking her panties between his fingers, the crotch damp against his skin, he ripped them with a swift yank, shredding the cotton concoction. Raising them to his face, he inhaled her scent deeply. She watched him, that gaze of hers lighting up again, from behind a bright blue flash this time. He spread her delicate dark pink soaking folds and surveyed the exquisiteness before him. With one hand on her clit, he pressed down slowly on the swollen button. May released a moan, closed her eyes, and pulled one leg up on the rock, spreading herself more for him. Jake placed his thick engorged head at the entrance of her channel. He nudged forward, breaching her. Her sweet velvety pussy swallowed the tip of his cock, hugging it firmly, Her muscles flexed inside as if she were pulling him deeper into the tight wetness. May gasped as he moved in a little bit deeper. He filled her. He took her breath away, stretching her, almost painfully, but with a delicious hint of the pleasure that was to come. She raised her leg, gently placing them on his hips, then wrapped them around him fully as she grabbed his shoulders and impaled herself on him. Jake let out a groan. His hand found purchase under her ass, pulling her in closer, plunging in deeper. He found a rhythm and drove into her over and over, pushing them both to a climax. She screamed his name as a furious surge of an orgasm flowed throughout her body. The first sound of thunder cracked in her ear, making her jump. Her muscles clenched around him tightly, squeezing him, not allowing him to move. Jake paused, kissing her lips.
"Will it rain?"
Lightning rippled across the sky, white veins on a black canvas. A flash of lightning lit up his face.
"No,"
May smiled.
"I'm not sad. That was a direct result of my elemental."
She yelped as another orgasm's aftershock traveled through her body. In the distance, thunder rumbled.
"I should get the training that I passed up on to help me control this elemental better. And miss the lightning show?"
He kissed the tip of her nose, then took her tongue hostage in a kiss that left her breathless. Jake picked up the rhythm in the exact same place he'd left off, and amid an assortment of lightning flashes, he took her to a place she hadn't been in such a long time and never thought she'd ever be again. And then he joined her in that magical place while the thunder rolled.
God, did we make a mistake? This again?
Jake thought they'd settled this.
I'm thinking of Anna and Brad. You think too much.
He kissed her forehead. A shiver ran through her. Was it that she was cold, or was it because of his touch? This woman certainly kept him on his toes.
I just know how you feel about Anna. That has nothing to do with what I feel for you. This is wrong. Nothing is more right. Tell me you don't feel the same way. I thought we straightened that out. I can't say that I don't feel the same way. It does feel right.
You're my heart, my soul, my everything.
My couple bond with Brad no longer feels like anything different. It used to tingle even though he's been gone for a long time. Now it doesn't do anything. You know what that means. I know it can't mean anything but that. So let's stop denying what we both want. Let's stop second-guessing and move forward.
May nodded.
And if I have moments where I falter, I will never doubt my feelings for you and yours for me. But if I have moments where I doubt I'm a good person because I moved forward, making it official would change that.
An indigo light flashed in the depths of her eyes.
Can I think about that? Can we talk to Astra first? I don't want her to be upset.
Jake didn't want to tell her that Astra endorsed this fully. Let Astra tell her that. Chapter 15. The next evening, Jake and May joined Astra and Kane for dinner at their cabin. May hadn't wanted to wait before asking Astra for her blessing. Jake pushed his chair back.
I'll get coffee.
Kane followed suit.
I'll help.
May gave him a look as if to say, "You're going to make me handle this alone?" Jake and Kane puttered in the kitchen, messing with the coffee machine, unable to avoid hearing what the women were saying because of their shifter senses.
Should we go outside to give them some privacy?
Jake asked Kane. Kane laughed softly.
Nah. Fact is, Astra knows already. Her elemental talked to her, and I think it talked to May's, or at least that's what I think Astra was trying to explain to me. Anyway, the bottom line is, May's going to ask her for permission or her blessing or whatever. Astra's going to give it. Then Astra's going to ask May for something. No shit! It's that choreographed?
Jake couldn't help the smile that came to his face. He had some serious Spitfire women in his family.
Yeah, and...
Almost as if she'd been cued, Astra squealed in the other room. The sound of chairs scraping was followed by sounds of joy. Kane peeked.
They're hugging.
He shook his head.
Astra's something else. That's a fact.
Jake agreed.
So what's my little girl going to ask her? She really should ask you both at the same time, but you know Astra. She does things the way she wants. True that. She wants to know more about this elemental stuff. May doesn't really know that much. She said she left that life behind, didn't do the training or something.
Jake couldn't elaborate on it much. May wasn't always interested in discussing it. Instead, he reached for the coffee grounds.
Guess I really should make the coffee.
May released her hug on Astra. Had she really just asked her to do that?
I don't know.
Please, I can't do this without you. And I don't want to. I want Dad there, too. May, I have to. I simply must. And it's the last tie I have to my mother. I know she was just like me. May sighed. This was difficult. It pulled on her guilt for having Jake when Anna was dead. But she loved Astra dearly.
Yes, I know your mother had ties to the elemental world.
You don't have to stay if you don't want to. Just take me there and introduce me to them. Show me. Then if you want to leave me, you can. Kane and I will stay. But I must, absolutely must know more. I have to learn about this elemental thing, because otherwise it feels like sometimes I'm riding a tornado. May knew that feeling, and she'd run away from it.
Okay, after you return from your trip to Europe, we'll look into going to see the Order. You'll meet Circe and Marco. And hopefully nothing will happen.
Epilogue. A few days later. Jake rolled over. They were laying in bed at May's. He leaned closer and took her rosy-tipped nipple in his mouth. Her nipple hardened instantly, and he could scent her arousal. He flicked the hard nub with the tip of his tongue.
It's time.
His hand courted the other nipple with lazy circles that made her quiver. They'd spent the whole morning in bed, teasing, tempting, tasting. They'd had breakfast in bed, such as it was, because neither wanted to let the other one go for long. He rolled her over on her hands and knees, pulled her body tight against his. Pushing her legs apart after a morning of foreplay, he'd reached a point he couldn't wait anymore. He felt her moist pussy against his throbbing cock and spread her legs, and sheathed himself into her with one swift and sweet drive.
Ugh, Christ, May.
The sweetness of her heat, the tightness of her muscles pulled the groan from him. He lay on her back, his next groan captured by the white flesh of her shoulder. He lifted her hips, pulling her in tighter, and began to ride her, taking her gifts as his own prizes and giving her the treasure of his love. In and out he pushed and pulled. The force between them stronger than gravity, his bear and her elemental joining in the eternal dance and battle. When she began to convulse, a scream beginning, he clamped down on her, taking the soft flesh of her shoulder in his mouth. The opposite side of the one she'd been marked on before. He clamped down, letting his canites breach the flesh, and then he paused while the pleasure of the couple bond became so powerful that they both began to climax together. "Jake," May whispered. He licked the spot, sealing the wound.
Forever. Want to make it official?
How can it be more official than what you just did? May touched the couple bonding mark. It tingled and was warm to the touch. She'd missed that sensation. It was on the other side of her neck from the mark Brad had given her. Jake hadn't wanted to discredit or diminish the love she and Brad had shared. Then a thought occurred to her.
Jake Evans, if by official you mean a wedding, absolutely not. Preparing and waiting for Grant and Chelsea's was enough for a very, very long time. He winked. So you're passing on a honeymoon? How about an unhoneymoon?
Jake raised a brow as if he were suspicious.
What are you thinking? When Astra gets back from Europe, why don't we take a trip with her and Kane?
May swallowed the lump that sprang into her throat as soon as she'd asked the question. It made her nervous to return there. She no longer belonged there.
Anywhere special? For her it is. How can I say no to the two most beautiful and dangerous women I know?
Jake kissed the tip of her nose. A blue light flashed in the depths of her eyes. This has been Attraction, Shifters Forever Worlds, written by Elle Thorne, narrated by Megan Kelly. Copyright 2014, 2016, 2017 by Elle Thorne. Production copyright 2018 by Elle Thorne.